All right, welcome everyone. It is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our next presentation. If you're just joining us, welcome to Winter Wild, presented by Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. And if you're here from an earlier session, welcome back. I am Emily Parnell. I'm a park ranger with the National Park Service here in Boston. Just a reminder that you're able to turn on closed captioning by clicking on the CC button that's at the bottom of your Zoom window. Our next presentation is titled Winter Wild, Photographing Natural Landscapes in Snow and Ice. Just because freezing temperatures and icy and snowy conditions have arrived doesn't mean that outdoor photography comes to a halt. Some of the most rewarding light and weather can be found during the coldest, snowiest months. The challenge is knowing how to properly capture that light to create compelling photographs. Our presenter will share techniques and composition advice for capturing stunning photos in wintry conditions. I would now like to introduce you to Paul Nguyen. Paul is a native of Massachusetts with more than 30 years of experience in film and digital photography. He currently specializes in digital photography of natural landscapes and wildlife, both here in New England and around the world, including in places like New Zealand, Iceland, and the Caribbean. In April 2017, he served in the prestigious National Parks Artist in Residence program at Petrified Forest in Arizona, and his work includes an exclusive assignment as the photographer for the gallery on the Charles River at the Museum of Science here in Boston. Since 2019, he's been an affiliated artist at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston as well. His images have been licensed by organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, Tamarin USA, Amazing New England Artworks, and numerous local and international publications. And his outstanding image making and teaching have gained him equipment sponsorships from Tamarin USA and Sun Surveyor. Paul currently serves as a program guide and brand ambassador for Swedish outfitter Fjällräven. To learn more about Paul, his work, awards, and photography workshops and instruction, you can visit his website, paulnguyenphoto.com, and there will be a link to that in the chat. And we're going to get ready for his presentation. Let's save our questions until the end, but if you come up with any throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. You should have a button that says Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, Paul, welcome to Winter Wild.
All right, thanks so much, Emily, and thanks everybody for your interest in my topic today, photographing in the winter, and what could be more appropriate on a day like this than learning to take pictures of it and making the most of it, right? So I am Paul Nguyen. If you've seen my work or are familiar with me from art shows around New England or exhibitions, or you've seen my images shared online without my knowledge, then you'll know that I am kind of a coast-to-coast and worldwide nature and landscape photographer. And I photograph in all kinds of conditions, and I'm actually usually chasing the most bizarre conditions and bizarre kinds of light to take my pictures in. I first became kind of involved more intimately with the national parks when I was a national parks artist in residence in 2017 out in Arizona. And ever since then, I've been trying to promote the mission of the national parks and trying to get people to visit and embrace national parks through my photo tours and workshops that span coast to coast. And I also run photo workshops and tours in other parts of the world as well. I'm going to share with you my knowledge of landscape photography and how that translates to the season that we're in. So when it comes to landscape photography and an extension of that, winter landscape and nature photography, there are two types of goals. There's artistic goals and there are technical goals. When it comes to the artistic goals, I feel like the real mission there is to capture the experience of being there for people who are going to look at your photo, right? And that goal can be an experience that's real or imagined, right? You can make it very typical, you can make it very dreamlike, or you can make it very realistic. And that comes with great composition. The most important part of the artistic goal is composing, what you put into your scene. And the goal of that, the goal of what you put into your scene is, I feel, to make people think that they're going to step into the scene, like it's right there, like it starts right where they are and it goes deeper, right? It's not this thing that's out there, it's just right here. There are a couple of types of interpretation that you could use to accomplish your artistic goals, you could go for sort of the more typical, or you could be a more unique interpreter, right? You could say, do I want my picture to look like what other people have done? Do I have a picture that I would like to make that I've seen on Instagram or something like that? Or do you want to be completely different, right? You can ask yourself, do you want to have a more documentary approach? Do you want to make it look like Time Life Books or National Geographic, or a little bit more artistic, a little bit more impressionist? When it comes to the technical goals, I feel like they are there to support your artistic goals, right? So you're looking to capture color and detail appropriately so that you can accomplish your artistic goals. And in doing that, what makes your photos a little bit more artistic will be your technical knowledge of lighting, using different types of light throughout the day to produce different looks, using different seasons, right? And these differences are what might make your photo look different from somebody who takes the exact same picture from the exact same spot, right? It could just be a difference of light and season. So what are the tools and skills you need to accomplish all of these goals? So when it comes to winter, why do we bother photographing in winter, right? Artistically speaking, I think a blanket of ice and snow just transforms a landscape. It makes something that looks very ordinary or recognizable, and it turns it extraordinary, right? Things that are messy suddenly become very neat and very tidy, like all the underbrush under the forest, little bits of debris here and there. When you cover them up with snow, it just simplifies things and it makes it more kind of digestible in that sense. The sun stays lower in the sky throughout the day than it does in the warmer months. And this creates a sort of a warmer aesthetic, right? Which is sort of ironic because in the winter you get the warmer light, and that makes pictures a little bit more engaging, to say the least. It's a less commonly seen look to photographs, right? So this is just an ordinary stream, but when it's got ice on it, you say, wow, what is that? And it really kindles your imagination to say, what lies underneath that? And what might this look like at another time of the year? I'm curious now, right? So sometimes the less you show, the more powerful your photo becomes. And snow, a lot of times, just shows less. And of course, the bonus reasons, because photographers like me are lazy, right? So sunrise is much later. You don't have to get up as early to find the dawn, right? So that's always a plus. And then sunset is much earlier, right? So you get a later sunrise, you get an earlier sunset, and you can have a dinner at a reasonable hour, and you finish your day of shooting in a much more sort of compact time frame. So that's always nice, right? Well, the goals for what you're looking for, what you're opening up your eye to in the winter is, I would say, forms, shapes, right? Since snow scenes can be overwhelmingly white, for lack of a better word, right? Like if you go out today, you're like, well, what do I take pictures of on a day like today? Everything is white, right? You need forms and you need shapes to draw people's eye into the photo. And then, rather than just the plain white sky or even just a snowy sky, you look for splashes of color that make your photo kind of compelling from near to far, right? So, I consider it pretty easy to walk outside on a snowy day and just take a picture. And that goes for any kind of landscape, right? It's easy to just walk outside and take a picture, but how do you differentiate your picture from others? And how do you make it say something? How do you make it speak? Usually you're looking for an uncommon condition. Look for the rare splashes of color that you might otherwise not see, right? Also look for the way you can use lights and the direction of it creatively. A low-angled sun against ice and snow shows more transparency and it shows more color in the ice. Whereas when you shoot with the sun in the middle of the day at a higher angle, the ice reflects the light and you get more white. So that's one of the ways in which you can sort of decide when you want to go out there to illustrate the point that you're trying to make. I also use backlight a lot. A lot of people are afraid to or think they shouldn't shoot with the sun in front of them, right? Kind of shining right at the camera. But if you do it right, if you keep the sun in front of you, but maybe not directly in the frame, it can do pretty amazing things for you. Here I have sun going through an icicle, and a scene that would otherwise just be an icicle takes on this whole new radiance, right? You see sun star bursts inside the ice, and it really just takes this photo to a level that it wouldn't have otherwise. So what about people, right? Like people often say, or think that a landscape or a nature photo shouldn't have people in them, but there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to art, right? I feel like many times adding an environmental component to make it more of a portrait or an action shot rather than just a straight up nature shot can actually enhance what you're doing, or at least be sort of a companion photo to your main photo, right? So I put a person in there sometimes, even if that isn't something I can sell, because most people don't want to buy something that has a picture of that has a person in the picture. Sometimes having this in sort of the catalog can really help sell your shot and really get your point across, right? It tells more of a story. Like if I just show you these icebergs, you don't know how big they are, you don't know anything about them really. But once you put this person in there, while it's maybe less artistic in some sense, it adds some relatability to the photo. So a human subject really creates a sense of scale. And the less recognized part of this is that sometimes a human subject can tell your viewer, the person looking at your photograph, where to look, right? So if I have my human subject facing in a certain direction, it tells the viewer of my photograph to look in that direction. And that is a kind of a storytelling element in its own right. It gets people to kind of funnel their attention in an upward direction in this case, whereas otherwise they might have just tried to look straight through the trees. Don't be afraid to get close either, right? Because just because you see snow all over the environment, you might be so compelled to try to capture it all. But sometimes trying to do everything is trying to do too much, right? And I always ask people, see not only the big picture, but see the little picture, see the details, detail in, if you will, right? So getting closer to your features can often reveal what you might miss. So you might want to have that close-up lens handy to just slap on there and try something different when otherwise all you're seeing is white out in the environment. Don't be afraid to go out in the dark, safely, of course, right? I've always said less light is better. I make my best photographs sometimes in light that nobody even bothers to go out in. So maybe try that tonight, right? After it stops snowing, get out there and see what you can do with all this snow, but in less light. This was actually taken around 11 at night, and you wouldn't know it because I'm just doing these long exposures that gather a lot of light, but you get a different atmosphere at night, right? You don't have that same kind of commotion of the day, and everything just takes on this sort of mystical stillness. And from a technical standpoint, the light, when there's less of it, actually becomes a lot more manageable. There's no hard shadows here. There's no weird hot spots that come from the light hitting the snow directly, and everything just becomes nice and even and very easy to digest. So there's a delicate balance there, right? If you're looking out your window out right now, you're saying it's pretty snowy and it's pretty darn cold, right? And I'll tell you, maybe this isn't the ideal conditions for taking the best picture, because sometimes what you want is cold enough for there to be snow and ice, but not cold enough to freeze everything solid, right? The strength of this particular photo is the reflection. And you kind of lose that when you go out and it's too cold, right? If it's been, maybe 20 degrees for a couple days, every body of water will be frozen solid. And then you might get a kind of a dull frosted reflection, but you don't get this symmetry that you get when it's not quite as cold. And likewise, a lighter dusting of snow can sometimes be more photogenic than the heavy blizzard type of dump that we're getting outside now, right? Because you just want the snow to kind of outline the features in your scene, right? Not necessarily to just be this drenched, heavy kind of compression that just weighs down all of the branches. So how do we compose in pictures to make them compelling? This is actually the most important part of photography. People are always asking me about, oh, wow, your pictures are great. What kind of camera do you use? And I say, well, you can use any camera, right? They're all good these days. The magic of your photograph is what you put in it, what you don't put in it, and how you put the elements in your picture so that they make sense. So over the years, composition is like rhythm. You might say people either have it or they don't. And if they have it, it's really hard for them to explain to somebody who doesn't have it how to do it. But as an instructor over the years, I've had to figure out how to explain composition in such a way that it goes from natural to being very sort of translatable. And so, going back into the history of art, there's been this thing called the rule of thirds, which divides your image into kind of a tic-tac-toe board. And the important elements go on the intersections in the board or on the lines. So I usually put one main subject on an intersection. So this big iceberg in the front goes on one intersection. Another iceberg goes on another intersection. That's my secondary subject. And then a horizon, if you have one, would go on one of the thirds, right? So if I want to prioritize more of the foreground, I put the horizon on the upper third, because then 2/3 of my picture is the foreground. And you have to decide whether you want more foreground or more sky, depending on which one makes more impact in your photo. The way I can tell a beginner photographer is they always put the horizon right in the middle, because they say, oh, well, the sky's nice and the ground's pretty good too. I want to show both. But then if you're emphasizing both, you're really not emphasizing either, right? So that's part of the art of photography, is deciding what's important and giving more weight to that. So decide what's more important, sky or foreground, and then put that on one of the thirds. Most people, when they're composing landscapes, don't try nearly enough vertical shots, right? So I always say, whenever you find a composition that you think works in horizontal, also try it in vertical and just see how it turns out, or at least take it home and see what you think, right? And just the same as with horizontals, you want to compose your verticals with the rule of thirds in mind, right? So main subject on one of the intersections, have secondary subjects kind of on the other intersections, and of course the horizon would be on one of those intersections rather than directly across the middle. Like I said, what's important about a photo is what you include, but also what you exclude. And you always want to make your photo as compact as you can. So this winter photo of Scituate Lighthouse with the wreath on it, it's a rare moment, right? It's got the winter wreath, it's got the full moon that rose right behind the lighthouse head, which only happens for a couple seconds each time it happens at all. That's the highlight of the photo, and that's enough for the composition, right? To show this amazing feature and a little bit of what's around it, but I don't need to show you that sort of long landscape format that your camera shoots in. So I cropped it into a square. And then that gives you and your viewer a lot tighter of an interpretation, right? So I always tell photographers, if your viewer can sort of guess or even imagine what might be past the edges of your photo, sometimes you're better off not including it at all, right? And just show people what's important. When there's no single main subject, you can use the thirds in a different way. You create zones with them. And I think of this as sort of looking like a flag, right? If you look at the like a German flag or Italian flag, you could say that it exists in 3 bands that represent 3 different things. So I sometimes create 3 bands in my photos too. A foreground band, midground, and background. And you can kind of compose that way, where you might have some important things in the middle band or in the top band, and then the other bands would sort of support that, right? So you don't ever want to necessarily include just one band, because then there's no context, right? If I just showed you these sandhill cranes making their winter nesting grounds in Nebraska, there's no context, right? But if I show you the cornfield, you say, wow, okay, so that's their habitat. If I show you the woods behind you, that's another contextual element too. So this photo tells a complete story without being too cluttered and without having even a main subject. So I showed you this picture before, but when it comes to the rule of thirds, if you do want to put your kind of middle right down the middle, look for symmetry, right? Because symmetry is the one time where you might say a photo can traditionally exist with being divided exactly in the middle, right? So here the subject and the reflection divide the image in half, and then you don't have to use the rule of thirds there, because the photo already has a nice balance to it, and there's a visual weight that exists for your subject and its reflection almost equally, right? So the subject will be just a little bit brighter than its reflection, and that's kind of all the visual weight you need, right? If a person were to look at this, they would be drawn from the bottom to the top, and then their eye sort of completes the movement through the photo that you're looking for. So if there's something to be said about photos and how you compose them, it's that you do want your viewer to look from near to far. So your goal is to get people to look deeper into the photo. The way you do that is not only with the rule of thirds and with aligning elements properly, but by using leading lines, right? The jetty here in Situate has a very nice line that people will naturally follow from where they are deeper into the photo along the curve of the jetty. So this is what I was talking about at the very beginning when it comes to composition. Make people feel like they are in the photo, right? Like it's a window they could just put a foot into and keep walking. And that's the best kind of photo. That's why if you looked at any of the photos that I showed you, you might recall there's nothing in the middle usually, right? I put everything off center. There's lines that go from near to far, but the middle doesn't really have anything important. Nothing. They tend to look for other things. They move around the photo and they say, okay, well, what am I looking for? What's the next thing that catches my eye? If something's off center, they'll see that. And then something deeper into the background, they'll follow deeper into the photo. So the longer you can get somebody to look at your photo, the more compelling it is, right? This is sort of like a statistical phenomenon even. The longer you get somebody to look at your photo, and then the more times you can get somebody to look at your photo, the more, I guess, the more artistically pleasing it is. And whatever metric you're using, whether you are getting your friends to like your photo, whether you want more likes on Instagram or you want to sell your photo, the same metric holds, right? Or if you just want to appreciate it yourself, the more times you look at it and the deeper and longer you look at it, the more compelling the photo is considered to be. So when it comes to using natural light, snow and winter conditions create this warm, gentle light that is incredibly appealing, right? And it's especially true in the early and late parts of the day. You might have heard the term the golden hour, and that's the hour right after the sun rises and the hour right before the sun sets, where the light just is warm, the shadows are long, and everything works in your favor. And you can just use your principles of composition to lead people into your photo. But your camera doesn't always do that well with these conditions. We're going to get into a little bit more kind of technical, part of the technical goals of photography now. Your camera actually always underexposes snow scenes. And this at first seems a little unintuitive because you would think that when things are kind of white and they're bright, you would think a camera would overexpose, but it's just the opposite. If you've ever tried this, if you've ever tried taking pictures of snow or like even a white wedding dress or one thing on a white background because you're trying to sell it on eBay or something, you'll find that the white parts always turn gray. And the reason for that is the camera sees all this brightness and it tries to turn down the exposure, right? So it meters it and says, whoa, this is really bright. Let's turn this exposure down to make everything seem more neutral, because the camera's exposure meter, its main goal is to make everything seem neutral. And that's not always reality, right? Sometimes you really do want white to be white. So you need to make a few technical adjustments to compensate for that. And this is called exposure compensation. So first, let's talk about what mode we shoot in so that we can make use of this, right? If you shoot in full auto, then you're at the camera's mercy and you can't do things like adjust the exposure. But if you shoot in one of the semi-manual modes, then you can really start to take control of some of your exposure settings. So I use the mode called Aperture Priority, which on most cameras is reflected with this A here. Don't confuse A with auto. It's not the same. Auto is usually A plus with in green, or it just says auto, right? If you use a Canon camera, it won't say A, it will say AV, which is aperture value. In this mode, you're changing the aperture of the camera, which is how big the little lens iris opens and closes. And this is a semi-manual mode. So that's the part that you control. And then the camera figures out the rest for you, right? So you would choose the aperture or the f-stop, and the camera sets a shutter speed for you that gives you the correct exposure. So it's pretty easy to use. Basically it gives you some control, and then your camera takes care of the rest. And it's great for controlling things like depth of field. If you're, this is a bigger discussion than just winter photography, but if you're doing portrait photography or you're doing landscape photography, you'll want different amounts of depth of field, right? And this mode gives you control over that. But other than that, the camera will help you out, right? If you've chosen the first part, meaning what the f-stop is, the aperture is, it will then choose for you the shutter speed to get the lighting to properly expose. This is the most useful mode all around. However, in the winter, it doesn't necessarily work in your favor. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a second. So continuing on with what you need, other than this mode called Aperture Priority, I always shoot with a tripod, right? Because when you're doing landscape work, regardless of the season, this tripod gives you a lot of flexibility to compose your image and keep it stable. Lets you shoot with less light, right? Because sometimes the best light is almost no light at all. I use the low sensitivity setting on my camera, which gives me the highest picture quality. I use Aperture Priority, as I talked about. I'll set my aperture to f11 or f16, which gives me a lot of depth, right? So this is kind of a fundamentals of photography discussion. So I'm looking for a lot of depth because I'm shooting a landscape. And then I use manual focus, right? I don't really trust autofocus because when you're shooting a landscape, the camera doesn't always know what's the important part of your photo, right? If you're shooting a portrait or sports, the most important part is always the person or the thing that's moving, right? But with a landscape, it's kind of all important. It's kind of all out there, right? So you want to manually focus, and I would manually set my lens sharpness a third of the way into the scene. So if I looked at the frame of my picture, right, I go 1/3 of the way up the photo, I look for something there and I focus on that. And then because I'm shooting with a lot of depth of field, the sharpness goes throughout the whole photo, both towards me and deeper into the background. The camera then determines the shutter speed for me. And if you guys are, those of you out there who are accomplished with your cameras, if you use white balance, then I use it subjectively, right? You can use a daylight, cloudy, or shade setting, or even auto, and that will give you different looks, right? So if you change your white balance, you'll see sometimes your picture gets warmer, and sometimes it gets cooler, meaning it's either more bluish or it's more orangish or yellowish, right? And that's subjective. You can make pictures kind of mirror the warmth of the late day light by using a white balance setting that reflects that. Okay, if you have the ability to set your picture style, set it to something like vivid or landscape if you want to bring out the punchy colors of your landscape, or just set it to standard if you want a more neutral look. And there's nothing wrong with, you know, changing these settings. It doesn't make your photo any less real, because back in the film days, when I started by shooting negative and slide film, depending on what type of film you would load in your camera, the same scene would look different, right? So if I loaded a high contrast slide film into my camera in the 90s, it would look very different than if I loaded sort of a dull negative film into my camera. And with digital, it's the same thing. You can make your pictures look a little bit more like slide film, or you can make them look a little bit more like negative film from the 70s, right? A little bit more dull look. And that's entirely up to you. There's no right or wrong answer to that. And there's no, you know, it's not cheating just because you change the color setting, right? So how do we address the point that snow scenes get underexposed? There's this button with a plus minus on your camera, and this is called exposure compensation. You change the brightness of your exposure because the camera isn't getting it right, right? So in aperture priority mode, if you apply the exposure compensation, either in a plus or minus direction, the camera will adjust what shutter speed it uses so that the picture will come out a different brightness. So this is the best example of that. If you're shooting into a picture, right, and you haven't applied any exposure compensation, it might look kind of neutral like this. If you apply a plus exposure compensation, your picture gets brighter. If you apply a negative exposure compensation, your picture gets darker. So if you take a picture in a snow scene and you see that it looks a little dull and a little kind of gray instead of white, go ahead and apply a +1 or a +2 to that until the white looks bright again, right? Bright, but not too bright. You don't want it so white that it's kind of like brighter than reality, right? But you want the white to actually look like snow. So how do I get a good shot, right? Like, what do I look for in a good exposure when I have like a bunch of different lighting conditions that I'm looking for? People will often say, well, I'm taking a picture and I'm facing into the sunset, and either I get, really nice looking sky and then the foreground is completely dark, or I get a really bright foreground and the sky is completely blown out, right? It's too bright. I can't even see it anymore. Well, the way I shoot digitally is I'm always looking to protect the sky, right? The sky is generally the brighter part of your photo, or in case of the snow scene, the snow could be the brighter part of your photo, right? So you're looking to get the brightest part of your sky to be properly exposed, right? So I tend to look to expose my picture as bright as possible while protecting the sky. If you guys are avid photographers and you look at your histogram, you'll want your histogram to go all the way to the right side and just touch, right? That's where the brightest part of your photo will be exposed properly. If you guys are just starting out and you don't know how to use your histogram, just look at the photo itself and say, well, does my sky look correct, right? And then expose the sky as bright as possible, right? Use your exposure compensation to brighten your picture just to the point where the sky looks about as bright as it can get without being unrealistically bright, right? If that's the case, and you're shooting into a sunset, your foreground might be too dark, right? This is that sort of nightmare scenario that we see in photography where you can't get both to blend properly. And so, you take the picture as I'm recommending here, you just expose for the sky. And then in your edit, whether you're using your smartphone to edit, because you can do all these edits on your smartphone now, or you use Adobe Lightroom or something like that, you use the tools available to you to then brighten the shadows, right? So if you look, if you look at this image, you'll see that the sky has retained its brightness. If you look at the little graph down below, the little graph only goes to the right side and doesn't get any brighter than it was in the left scenario. But then the shadows have moved further to the right, right? So I've taken my tools and just taken this little slider called shadows, move it to the right, and that brightens the shadows. And then my photo looks balanced again, where you can see both the sky and the foreground, and both of them look recognizable. Neither one is lost as far as details go. So let's move on to a different topic that I love about winter. You don't see it often around here, right? But I travel all over the world to see what goes on in the winter, right? And the Aurora Borealis is one of the real highlights of why we might love shooting in the winter. The Aurora Borealis happens because the solar wind comes towards the Earth's atmosphere and interacts with the Earth's magnetic field. And when it does that, the atoms inside the Earth's atmosphere will then release photons, right? And those photons are seen as light that dances in the atmosphere. And this is a very sought after phenomenon, obviously. Sometimes it hits here, very rarely, but most of the time I'm going north quite a bit to see these. You can go to Maine and see them, or you can go even further to Alaska or Iceland and see them. And frozen landscapes like winter are a perfect kind of foreground for this aurora, right? If you can get out there and see this is the ultimate way to kind of take a scene that would otherwise be somewhat boring and make it, kind of in some ways literally an otherworldly phenomenon. So here I'm sort of defying the normal settings for my landscape photography. I have to use a very high sensitivity. I use a very wide open aperture. And then I'm using shutter speeds that are a little bit longer, but not too long, so that I can get the movement of the aurora to be minimized, right? Because if you do too long of an exposure, which the camera tends to want to do at night, the aurora will move too much. And then after a while, it just looks like a blur, right? You see a green blur. So you want your exposure times to be just a few seconds long so that you'll get a bright enough picture, but then the aurora won't be all smeared out and lost as far as the definition. Okay, so you increase your chances, like I said, by going to the right places. You might wait around, here in New England for some aurora, but I like to go further north and further afield to some of these aurora hotspots, and you go at the right time, right? You can go in the dead of winter, but really what you're looking for is from equinox to equinox. So September to March is sort of the time when aurora can happen. And I've gotten some great tips from dedicated aurora photographers who told me to go during the equinox. So I went to Fairbanks, Alaska during the spring equinox, and it was the best aurora show of the year, right? So you don't necessarily have to suffer through the coldest months of the year to see this great natural phenomenon. So how do you know when all this will happen? I use apps, right? There's the smartphone in your pocket is an amazingly powerful tool. And I use apps like the Aurora Northern Eye, or I can check spaceweather.com or go to noaa.gov to find my space weather. And even beyond that, you have to make sure the regular weather cooperates too, right? Like if it's cloudy, there could be all the aurora in the world and you won't see it, right? So I've heard so many times people go to Iceland and they're like, but we didn't see the northern lights. And I say, well, Iceland's cloudy a lot of the time, right? There's always an aurora happening, but if it's cloudy, it doesn't do you much good. So while I have seen the aurora in Iceland, I think Alaska is a lot better place to go because Fairbanks, Alaska has just a lot more clear sky. So the most important aspect in winter photography, and especially this sort of low light and night winter photography, is your safety, right? So you're saying, okay, so this guy went out on the ice to photograph the northern lights. Why would you do such a stupid thing, right? So the idea is that I attempted to take as much stupidity out of the equation as possible by scouting during the day, right? So this is what this same location looks like during the day. It's even the same crack in the ice, right? I'm using a slightly different lens, so it doesn't look exactly the same, but you'll see that I was there during the day to kind of push my luck a little bit and say, is this going to hold me, right? And then I'll use my GPS to tag this location. So then when I come bumbling back at night in the dark, I know that at least that part of it will be safe, right? And of course, also, if you find a spot that you think will be good, that's something to do during the day as well, right? Like your day is the time when you can actually see and plan for your night shot, rather than just driving around in the night being like, oh, well, I wonder if this place is good, right? You're just going to waste a lot of time and potentially hurt yourself doing that. So what are some of the considerations other than what we've talked about that you might not have thought of? Well, winter being cold, it really reduces the battery life on your camera, right? So you're going to want to make sure your batteries are charged up. You're going to want to carry a lot of extra batteries with you. And better yet, when you go out for the shoot, keep your extra batteries in a warm pocket, right? Because if you keep them, in your camera pack, they might even get cold in your camera pack. You might encounter some unexpected camera errors and autofocus problems, right? You can't really prevent this because cold just, like it does on your car, it just wreaks havoc on all things that are mechanical, all things that are electronic, right? So you can't necessarily prevent that from happening, but if you have a camera that's considered, a little bit more robust, a little bit more weather sealed, that can help you. And then, of course, not needing autofocus is great, right? That's why another reason why I suggested manual focus, because autofocus doesn't always work so well when the motor of your camera is frozen, right? Snow and ice can get on your lens and ruin your shots. This is something that on certain days you can't really prevent, but you really do have to be mindful of cleaning off your lens often if you're taking the lens cap off and then snow and ice are flying onto them. I'll show you a little trick in a little bit that can help with that. If you can see me on the webcam, I'll demonstrate that. But as far as what you'll need to do winter landscape photography, I like a wide angle, wide aperture lens. And when I say wide aperture, something that can open as wide as 2.8, because that will help you with the low light shots. So a wide angle lens would be something like in the range of a 15 to 30 millimeter or 11 to 16. So for those of you who know cameras, the lower numbers for the lens are wider, right? So like a 15 millimeter is wider angle than a 24 millimeter. You need a sturdy ball head tripod. So going out in the snow, the ground isn't particularly level, is it? So if you use that old tripod with the little stick and that only sits on flat ground that you might have found in your grandfather's attic, that is a tilt swivel tripod. You don't want that. You want the ball head tripod because the ball lets you level it in as many directions as you want, right? Because the ground isn't going to cooperate with you. If you're on a tilt, this ball will let you level your camera properly. And you need a good pair of tripod legs too, right? Because If you can adjust all the legs independently and one can move out while the other stays still, you can put your tripod legs on rocks and other forms of uneven ground that are much more helpful than the studio tripod that you might have found lying around, or you bought it on Amazon Basics or something like that. And then you deal with adverse weather to protect your camera with a number of sort of these protective solutions. So this brand called Rugged, I have no particular reason to promote them, but they just make some really nice things. They have a semi-reusable plastic sleeve that you can put on your camera, and after a while this will wear out. Or you can get a more permanent sleeve that goes around your camera and protects all the controls, and then it's got these little openings where you can put your hands in and manipulate the controls. So remember what I was talking about with why, and how you might try to prevent snow and ice from hitting your lens. If you can turn your attention to the webcam, I can demonstrate this for you so you can see me in the view. So I carry a shower cap, right? So at first you might think, okay, well, I'm going to use the shower cap to keep the snow off of me. That's not what the shower cap is for. This is Frankenstein behemoth is my camera. And it's got this lens that protrudes very far into the front of it. And the way I use the shower cap is I actually put the shower cap onto the lens, and then I put it over the body of the camera like this. And what does this do? Well, this keeps the snow and ice off of the camera temporarily, right? But I can still see through it, right? And when I'm on the tripod, I can line up my composition. I can get everything in place. I can see the environment and where the elements are in the environment. The snow and ice hits it, snow and ice hits it. When it comes time for me to take the shot, I lift it up, take the shot quickly, put the lens cap back on, right? Oh, sorry, the shower cap back on. So this is a much better alternative than using the lens cap because you can't compose through it. Your camera isn't able to gather any light, right? Whereas the shower cap, these you can get for free at the hotel you're staying in. You just take them, or you buy them by the 10-pack from Conair or something like that. And then you can have a very almost free solution for protecting your lens from snow and ice. Carry a headlamp with you, right? Because when you're shooting in the later parts of the day, you are going to return in the dark, right? And like I said, safety is of paramount importance. Have a headlamp with you. Carry extra batteries, both your headlamp and your camera, and keep them in a warm pocket. Carry a lens cloth and a blower. And, this is a little extravagant, but spare lens caps as well, because you might end up losing one in your course of your winter shoots. And when something falls in the snow, you might not find it again, right? Please try to pick it up for the sake of the environment. But if you don't, have a spare lens cap so that you can continue to protect your camera. So the most important asset is you, right? The most important piece of equipment is the photographer themselves. So people haven't decided whether these are called Glittens or glow mitts. I don't think either one is particularly catchy or clever. So I just call them flip top mittens. They allow a good balance of warmth and dexterity so that you can still control your camera. You can still take your lenses off, put filters on, manipulate your controls. And then when the nip of frost hits you, you can flip them over and protect yourself. Nice pair of winter boots, right? Because you are going to do a lot of standing. People are always eager to go for a walk in the winter, but they don't realize how much colder it is to stand than it is to walk. So a great pair of winter boots will let you stand out in the 0 degree weather and still be warm. And of course, hand warmers, right? I stick these into those glow mitts or glittens, right? Those flip top mittens, and they keep me warm through the shoot. You can put the larger version of these into your pockets. You can put them even into your shirt, and they make for a great way to just stay warm on these long shoots. And of course, they're a great value, right? You can buy them by the 40-pack, and there's no such thing as too many hand warmers. So that brings me to the end of my presentation on winter photography. If you want to find out more about my work through the workshops that I run and the tours that I lead, go to bluehourboston.com. And if you want to see more of my work and find out about my work with the National Park and then with the Museum of Science, go to paulnguyenphoto.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that awesome presentation. Definitely excited to go out and try to take some pictures maybe this weekend. Now we have a little bit of time left over for some audience questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your window. We have one question to kick us off from Christina. They want to know, where are some of your favorite places in Massachusetts to take photos?
So in Massachusetts, I like to take pictures in a few different places. I live in Hopkinton now, so around here, I like to take pictures of the Blackstone Dam. I like to go to around Quabbin Reservoir. In the South Shore, where I used to live, I would go to Situate Lighthouse. And then, of course, out on the Cape is really great too. You can take, a trip out to the Race Point Lighthouse and shoot out there. So it depends on what you're into, but if you're into great trees, I would go with central, areas around Central Mass and the Berkshires. If you're into lighthouses and coastal features, just go with Situate, Newburyport, of course, the Harbor Islands, right, and Cape Cod.
Awesome. Cindy wants to know if you ever use any filters when you're photographing snow scenes.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Cindy. Filters are not something I use other than to slow down the exposure, right? So I don't use filters for color. I don't use filters to kind of control light across different parts of my photos. The only filter I use is a neutral density filter, which is what I use to just slow down the exposure. It's like putting sunglasses on your camera, and it makes the whole picture darker, which lets me drag out the exposure so that I can get those long exposure effects of the water, right? So I'll just add that on, as I don't know, I guess you're pretty familiar with filters maybe, but I use like anywhere from 2 stops to 8 stops of neutral density just to slow down the exposures.
And Rachel wants to know if you have any tips or tricks on how to do winter photography with just a smartphone.
Yeah, so smartphones have pretty much kind of risen to the occasion as far as their performance compared to regular cameras, right? A lot of people are saying their smartphone takes better pictures. And yeah, I would agree with that. If you're not going to do any editing and all you want to do is take a photo straight out of the device and share it, smartphones are way better than that, right? But the same rules still apply. When a camera of any kind sees a bright surface, it tends to underexpose, right? So you know how when you use your smartphone, if you touch your smartphone, that little picture of the sun comes up and you can swipe up to make the picture brighter. Do that when you're in snow, right? Because when the smartphone meters on the snow exposure, it's going to try to turn it a little bit too dull and gray and neutral. So just swipe up to make the picture look a little brighter, and then the snow will look more realistic.
Laura wants to know what your opinion is on mirrorless cameras.
Yeah, so I've been using mirrorless cameras since 2015, and now I only use mirrorless cameras. So I started with Canon DSLR, meaning the conventional camera with the mirror in it. And when I switched to mirrorless, it wasn't because I really wanted a camera without a mirror in it. It was that at the time, the sensors in mirrorless cameras were becoming much more advanced, right? Particularly Sony sensors. And so once Sony sensors started getting put into other cameras that weren't Sony, all the cameras started being a lot better. These days, I use mirrorless because it's a more compact system. There are fewer moving parts in it. And it's just all around the progress that has happened with mirrorless cameras is just a lot better than has been for kind of now the old and outdated DSLR camera. Some of the downsides of mirrorless over the years have been that there aren't a lot of lenses, right? That's been addressed because now mirrorless is sort of the main platform. So there are a ton of lenses for mirrorless. The other downside being the battery life was very poor, and they've also corrected that, right? So now I've gone from Sony to Fuji mirrorless, and the battery all lasts, they all last, for your whole shoot. Like I've gotten through an entire week on just 1.5 batteries with mirrorless.
We have a follow-up question in the chat to our filter conversation. Do you ever use just a protective filter to protect the lens?
Yes, if your lens allows for it, it never hurts to put that on there, right? So I do advocate that for, like a zoom lens, or kind of a telephoto lens. A lot of wide angle lenses just don't take filters. So the lens that I was showing you, if you're looking in your webcam view at me, this lens doesn't really take protective filters, right? Because it's got this sort of bulgy front. So sometimes with wide angle, you just can't. But if you can, I would definitely advocate that. When it comes to Northern Lights photography, I learned that you should take all the filters off, because filters will actually affect the image when you're shooting Northern Lights. I don't particularly know why, but I've seen my pictures have like a little weird ring in the middle when I try to shoot the Aurora with the filter on.
A non-camera specific question, but are the hand warmers that you use, are they recyclable after you're done with them?
Those particular ones are not. I actually don't use too many hand warmers because of that. I find them a little bit sort of extravagant and wasteful. So I only use them when I absolutely need to. If you do want something that is reusable, they make such things as like a butane hand warmer, right? So you can put like a little bit of fuel on it in it, and it burns a little bit, kind of like it's like a slow burning lighter, you might say. And then it, you know, the main body of it is reusable, but it does consume some fuel.
You're running low on time, but I would like to know just a little bit about your background with photography, how you got into it, and what led you here.
Sure. So, you know, I learned photography from my father when I was growing up, and I started when I was 12. I never really thought I would do much with it, right? Like I actually started as a C student in high school photography, and then halfway through that semester, something clicked, and I'm like, oh, I get it now. I know how to make pictures that speak to people. And then I finished with an A plus, and I was like, wow, this is something I could really get into. But I never really thought much of it as a career. Years later, I got my degree in biology. I worked in the sciences for a little while, and I decided I would go back to the arts, but I started recording nature sounds. So I would go out into the woods with a microphone in stereo and record nature sounds. And I decided that I would need to take pictures of the scenes to kind of go along with those sounds so that I could promote them. And then over the years, the pictures started to get more popular than the sounds, and they started to take on a life of their own. And I just started a website for my photos. I started doing art shows around the local area, and then it just grew from there. It grew to more art shows, bigger art shows, and then eventually the commissions and sort of exhibitions and assignments that I do to this day.
Thank you so much. I think we can all agree that you are very good at what you do and great at teaching it as well. So thank you for joining us for this presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended today. We do have several more sessions throughout the rest of this afternoon. We hope you'll join us for our next one at 12 o'clock called Getting Outside in the Winter, an REI how-to guide. And if you have any questions about the rest of the schedule for the day, you can visit our Eventbrite or bostonharborislands.org. And that is it for this presentation. Thank you, Paul. We will see you all at 12 o'clock.